Welcome, everyone. I'm Lorilee Binstock, and you are listening to a Trauma Survivor Thrivers podcast on Mental Health News Radio Network. Thank you so much for joining us for the first episode of Season 6. I hope everyone's summer was amazing. I know I am welcoming fall with open arms while we get back to routine. Let's go ahead and jump right in. Today's guest is Melissa Kilbride, certified sex therapist. Her therapeutic approach is strengths-based and eclectic as she incorporates a variety of treatment modalities, including cognitive behavioral interventions, internal family systems therapy, which I'm actually a huge fan of, mindfulness, relational therapy, Gottman method for couples, sex therapy, and modern psychodynamic approaches. Melissa is also the co-author of the book Working with Worry, a workbook for parents on how to support anxious children. She has served on the Social Emotional Advisory Board for DC Public Schools. Melissa also presents workshops for parents on topics related to early sexual health education and consent, and hosts the Instagram handle Askable Mama to support this work. And we will also put that up, and all that information will be in the show notes. But first, Melissa, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk with you.
I know. Well, today's discussion, I feel like maybe uncomfortable for some parents, but I can't stress enough the importance of talking about sexual health with your children. And so I feel like you're the perfect person to talk to about this and how parents can actually do that effectively and comfortably.
I hope so. That's part of my work, right? I kind of come at this from two sides because I've worked with children in the past. I now work with adults and couples in my private practice. And so I often am seeing kind of what the outcomes of not talking about sex and sexual health issues have been kind of through all stages of development and the anxiety, the depression, and really the trauma that can come from the absence of early sexual health education.
Well, I mean, sexual health was never really a topic in my house as a child, except for, don't have it because you'll get pregnant and you'll ruin your life kind of situation. But as you may know, and as this audience knows, I'm a childhood sexual abuse survivor. So, clearly the irony, my mother would have not seen coming is that I probably would have been spared, the years of trauma if sexual health was like freely and openly discussed. And so I know there are people who are like, why would you talk about sexual health with your children? They're too young. But like, are you really ever too young to discuss it?
I don't believe you're ever too young to discuss it. And it really, there are 2 points that I make, and you touched on the first one, which is safety. It is actually preventative to be talking about sexual health education. And what that means for young kids is talking about body safety, body autonomy, giving them language for body parts and understanding what the difference is between okay and not okay touch. And then I believe that talking about sexual health issues for throughout the whole development cycle really is helpful in healthy relationships later, whether that be in understanding how bodies work and quite frankly, how they don't work, in understanding and accepting one's own and others' sexual and gender identities. So I think about it kind of through those two lenses, that there is a prevention and safety piece, and that there is a healthy relationships piece. And so that can start at any age.
Right. Like, because consent, I know that in talking to all of my guests who are a lot of them are childhood sexual abuse survivors.
Yeah.
And it was always go hug your uncle. He wants you. You don't be rude.
Right.
And and that can start very young. And I feel like I'm still telling, people and relatives, like still to this day, they're still forcing go hug your relative.
Yeah, and it's very generational. I mean, even
Yes.
with my own kids, when I have, and trust me, I mean, I do this work, but that is a hard boundary to set. I've struggled with it on behalf of my own kids at times. And when I've done it, I have received pushback from those family members, and I have been judged and gotten talkings to because the
Really?
generation, yeah, oh yeah, that, I think it is seen as disrespectful and rejecting, and that it gives, I think there's a sense that it gives children too much power, too much autonomy. Oh, you let them do whatever they want, or,
Mm,
it's seen as a sign of disrespect as opposed to what I think it really is, which is about establishing that when something feels uncomfortable in your body, you can and should listen to that. I think it also establishes this boundary between what is expected of me and what I am required to do, right? When a parent is there saying, you go do that, you go give that hug, you go give that kiss, and it goes against every single thing in your being. What is that? I mean, that's so confusing, and it's reinforcing us to kind of shut off the warning signals that are there for a reason.
yeah. Well, I feel like for you, you are a sex therapist. This is your practice. Like, do your relatives, are your relatives like, oh yeah, no, this is your profession, this is what you do. Like, we'll listen without any pushback. Because I think it's
No,
hard for us regular people who are just learning this, right?
I wish that were the case. I wish that were the case so much. But no, that's actually not. And I have had conversations with family members where I think they might have gotten a little bit more understanding of where I come from. But for the most part, no, I don't necessarily think it's even accepted by those who really understand what I do and where I'm coming from with it,
So how do we
unfortunately.
talk to them? Like, so what should we say? I know for me, obviously I have issues with people pleasing, and it does make me very
Sure.
uncomfortable to say no, no, like, and
Yeah.
I know it's like, oh, you should protect your child at all costs, but there's still that feeling of like, this is very uncomfortable. What are some ways we could say,
Yeah.
no?
I think the way that it has been most effective, at least with my own family and kids, and personally for me, is to be prepared with an answer. And
Hmm.
so, what I often do and what I suggest to others is kind of being ready with something like, it doesn't look like, Johnny wants a kiss right now. How about a high five?
Yeah.
Or maybe later, I'm getting the sense that so and so doesn't want to hug you or isn't up for a hug. And really, what I think is so important, because in part, what I hear in your question is how do we have the older generation or other people understand
Hmm.
it? And what I have done in my thinking is move away from that and focus more on what does my child need to hear and understand from me. And I think what I hope that they learn and see is that their feeling is respected, their feeling is acknowledged, their feeling matters. There's a difference between a kid cowering behind you, hiding from a kiss, and a kid who says something really nasty or mean to a grandparent, right? I'm not saying we shouldn't reprimand that. Um, but it is I'm a big believer in general as a parent that like kids should speak up for themselves, they should learn to self-advocate. But this is one area that I often say is an absolute exception. If you are watching your kid and recognizing that they are incredibly uncomfortable around something that is expected of them that is not necessarily appropriate and that has to do with body autonomy, it is absolutely a place to step in and model how they can set that boundary.
Right, because I mean, I think like if this is your uncle and you need to hug and kiss them, that let's say down the road that uncle has really not great intentions, like the trauma that can, lead into, because that child is always taught like I need to basically just this is an adult and I need to just do what the adult says. And I think
Exactly.
that scares me. That's very scary. So, like, how do you talk to our children about that?
Yeah, I think, well, so the first piece is kind of already what we're saying of modeling it, saying,
Yeah.
and then I think if an opportunity presents itself, it's great to go back later and have a follow-up, like, hey, you looked really uncomfortable when grandma was trying to squeeze you. Were you? Because that's what I
Mm.
picked up on. And helping them identify where was that uncomfortable in their body? How did they understand that that was something they didn't want? And what was it like for them to have that boundary set? I think that's really helpful for kids to be able to connect. what they were feeling and how it played out so that they can start to do that more on their own and recognize those feelings. Another piece that I would add here is that I think, and this goes into relationships, but I know I grew up in a generation where there was a lot of like going along to get along. And we talked a lot
Hmm.
about what expectations were, whether it's adults like we're talking about, but also boys. And I hate to be so gendered about it, but that's what it was in my experience. You know, boys
Yeah.
will want this and they'll want that. And if you want to be popular, or you want to go to prom, or you want to, the messaging, right, was that pleasure wasn't a part of it. What you wanted wasn't a part of it. It was just about what was expected. And so,
Yeah.
coming back to your question, I think it is really about talking to our kids in a way that debunks those as norms.
Wow. Yes. And in every stage there's always a stage in their like growing up, because I think what people are who are uncomfortable with the sexual health like piece to it, it's not as simple as like, okay, you don't have to hug your grandpa or uncle, but that I think it leads to consent. And I think a lot of people are like, oh, you're just going to go right in and talk about sex, but it's like very age appropriate in how we
Yeah.
move through that. And so I know as early as, we're discussing consent and children who don't want to hug or um, kiss a relative. But what is the next step? Where do you go from there in that discussion with a child as they get older?
It's a great question. I think of it as building blocks. So, part of these conversations when kids are young are actually for us as parents to practice. One of the things that often comes up in the work I do is parents might push back and say, well, my kid's not ready for that conversation. I'll talk
Right.
to them when they're 12, or I'll talk to them in puberty. And I mean, I say this all the time. If you can't say penis to a 3-year-old, you
Right.
are not going to be able to talk about these topics with a 12-year-old. And furthermore,
Hmm.
that 12-year-old is not going to hear them from you because it is already such an uncomfortable space for them to exist in
Wow.
with you. So, to your question, I think a large part of it is small conversations over time and practicing for parents. And then to the piece about consent, that conversation does grow, right? So, at a young age, we're maybe talking about a hug to grandma, but we might also be talking about, um, oh, I saw your friend holding your hand on the playground. Was that okay? Did you like that? How'd that feel for you? Or it looked like you didn't like that. And so bringing awareness to it amongst peers as well. And then as kids get older, and this is a big part of my work, is this idea of natural conversation starters. I love to use what we see in TV shows, what we hear in music, what we see in real life to start these kinds of conversations. And so, um, even let's say siblings, right? Siblings might wrestle and play, and you might get into a situation where you hear someone saying, "Stop, I don't, this isn't funny," or I don't, right? That's an opportunity to say, "Wait, I heard a boundary being set there. Did you hear that?
Hmm.
Because it
Yeah.
it looks to me or it sounds to me like this isn't fun anymore." That's just one example. And then as kids are getting older, I think there are opportunities that present themselves all the time. They're telling you something about their day, or like I said, kind of watching a show or something where you can say, I don't know, that didn't seem cool to me, or what do you guys think
Right.
how those people interacted? That seemed, odd, or just bringing awareness to it and then meeting them with kind of how they feel about it or what they've witnessed to start those conversations.
That's so funny because we were watching Sandlot. This was a while ago, but we were watching Sandlot, and there's that one part where the boy pretends to drown so then he can kiss the lifeguard. And I remember like pausing and being like, "Do you think that was a good idea?" Like
Perfect.
like that's unacceptable. That's unacceptable
Yeah.
behavior.
It's a
Um,
perfect example. I had, I don't know, I believe you're a bit younger than I am, but I grew up watching Punky Brewster, and they started airing it again. And so I thought I got so excited. I was going to watch it with my daughter. And the first episode we watched was where this boy tries to kiss Punky and she says no, but he keeps going. So she hits him. And the whole episode is about her getting in trouble for hitting him.
Yes.
And the punchline is actually that they have her apologize to him. And then he says, okay, now can we kiss and make up? And there's like this laugh track in the background. And it was because of the work I do, it was kind of eye-opening to me because I'm thinking of myself, at probably, I don't know, 7, 6, watching this show, probably not with an adult, and just internalizing the messaging there.
Right.
And I'm thinking, okay, now I just showed this to my daughter. Let me figure out what her experience was and let's talk about it. And so it's both an example of a conversation starter, but also an example of how I think we can start to reframe what our experiences were in a way that helps us to say, that maybe that wasn't so great. Maybe it
Yeah.
wasn't awesome that it was
No.
normalized in this way. Maybe it didn't help us become healthy, sexually healthy beings.
Wow, that's so that's so interesting because I actually had a friend a few years ago. She was telling me like, oh yeah, my daughter got in trouble because she punched a kid and busted his lip. And like this little girl was I probably 5 or 6 at the time. And I was like, what happened? And she was like, oh, this boy tried to kiss her and grab her. And I was like, well, what happened to him? And she's like, oh,
Right.
I don't know, but her daughter had to go to the principal and then she had to apologize. And I was like, but wait, does there no like he didn't have to apologize? This is nuts.
Right.
And like to them, that didn't even cross their mind, like, oh, this is wrong. And
Yeah.
and, and I guess that is the whole generational thing. It was
Yeah.
also down, in the environment that they live in. They don't have these are not conversations that they talk about, like you
Yeah.
and I are talking about, which should always be a topic of conversation.
Yeah, you're right. But you're absolutely right. I think some of it is generational, but there's also regional or what kind of home we grew up in and religion sometimes plays a role in how these things are
Right.
talked about. So there's a lot of different angles.
Right. Wow. Yeah. For me, my daughter, she was going in, she was going, this is her first year this summer going to like a sleepaway camp. It was only a week. It wasn't like, but a friend of mine who is local to DC, was just like, oh yeah, I remember going to that camp and when I was a kid and she had her first sexual experience there. And I was like, wait, what? And obviously she was older when she had that experience, and my daughter was much younger. But I was like, she's going to be around a lot of kids. Like, do I
Mhm.
need to have this conversation with her where it's like, okay, well, we do talk about like consent and touching and all of this stuff. Like,
Yeah.
she knows, like, if someone's touching her private, she's not like that's not okay.
Yeah.
But then I also didn't want like people talking about anything that has to do with sex that's like could be completely off and her be just like, what?
Yeah.
So, before she left, I talked to my husband, I was like, we need to have this conversation with her because we got the book Perfectly Normal.
It's a great book. I love it.
Yes, and it said like I think 10 and she's turning 10 in a couple months. So I was like, well, maybe it's not too soon and maybe I'm wrong here and please tell me if I am, but we read the book with her and I was really nervous having this I was like, okay. I was like, are
Sure.
you gonna do this with me? Like talking to my husband, he was like, sure. But then he was like caught up with work. I was like, well, we need to just I'll just do it. And so we read the book together and it was such a non-issue. Like she's
Yeah.
like she just read it and was like, okay. She's like, can I read it again? So like I guess to absorb everything that we discussed, I was
Yeah.
like, yes. And after, talk to me about whatever, if you have any questions. And
Yeah.
it was just so easy. And like I built this up in my head like this was going to be a whole thing. And I think a lot of it is because a lot of people don't have these conversations, at least when
Yeah.
I was growing up, that was not a conversation.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right. I mean, what you just explained is a perfect model of how these things should go because I think often we're operating from a place of fear or anxiety about our own experience. But what you described is that it just felt normal to your daughter. Like any
Yeah.
other book you might read on any given night, she's taking in the information she is curious about and can take in, and she's leaving behind the rest. And that's what I think about the starting early piece is that there, in my opinion, there's not necessarily an example of overkill. Like there might be language that you could use that's more appropriate at different ages.
Right.
But Deborah Rothman, who's a sexual educator, once said, I hope I get the quote correctly, but too much too soon is better than too little too late. And
Yeah.
I really think that that is a fact in these situations, that we are kind of arming our kids with knowledge that they are able to store for when they need it. They're able to take it in and ask questions about it if they're ready. And they're able to kind of put it aside if it's not something that they're ready to engage in. And I
Mhm.
wanted to take the opportunity to build on what you talked about with camp, because I think camp is an incredible opportunity for body safety conversations and sexual health conversations in general. Um, the idea of sometimes parents will say, well, won't I scare my kid if I bring this up? And I think there are ways that we can bring it up that are less scary, but I liken it to teaching a kid to cross the street. I mean,
Yeah.
what parent among us has not had a moment of saying, like, you will die if you run down the street like that? Like,
It's like, oh, yes, it's me.
right. Right. Like we use scare tactics when there are significant safety issues. And in many ways, I don't think this is any different. And so even using examples, I think when you're talking about camp or any, a sleepover or new setting, you can say something like, look, kids can be so silly and they might ask you to do wild things like take your clothes off or touch their privates, or they might think those things are kind of funny, but they're not, and they're not safe. And so if anyone asks you to do that, that's not a thing that we do. And I want to make sure, even though I won't see you for a week, you can tell me when you get home, because that's
Yes.
not a thing that's okay. And so you're really naming some of the specific things that can happen, but you're not doing it in a way that's like, and then this danger lurks at the in your bunk. You're just kind of bringing awareness so that if something like that does happen, the child knows, oh, I was told this isn't okay, as
Hmm.
opposed to never knowing it is a thing that exists in the world and feeling like they are the only person who has experienced it. And one thing, unfortunately, in part, that the research says is that we're not sure that sexual health education necessarily stops incidences of abuse, but it does reduce if it's whether or not it can be ongoing.
Right. I
And I'm not
agree.
saying that it doesn't stop it. We just don't have that research yet.
Hmm.
But we do have research that supports that kids who have language for body parts, kids who have been told and taught body autonomy, body safety, consent, are much more likely to report after one incident than kids who don't have that language.
Yes. Yeah. I agree. I agree. You brought up sleepovers because I know I speak to a lot of, like I said, a lot of childhood sexual abuse survivors, and they're like, I will never let my children sleep over at another person's house. Um, and I have to say, I do. My child has friends, and we know the parents, and we feel very comfortable. But I think also we talk about what's
Yeah.
okay and not okay
Yeah.
for that. And so I think that's one thing. I don't know what your thoughts are on like sleepovers and all of that.
It's so hard. I mean, when I started this work, my kids were teeny tiny. And of course, I was saying to the world, I will never allow sleepovers. We just know what happens there and I won't allow it. And then my kids got older and they wanted to go to sleepovers. And
Right.
I had to reflect a little bit differently on it. I am not a huge fan of sleepovers, but I have allowed them. I will say something that has transitioned for me a little bit over time is that I kind of always felt like, let me wait till later, till my kids are a little bit older,
Mm-hmm.
because they have more understanding, there's more awareness of what's acceptable and what's not. What I didn't really account for in my thinking about it was cell phones and access to social
Oh,
media. And so in some ways, I now fear the access that kids have at a sleepover on their devices more than I fear, danger of some sort of sexual abuse in the home.
That's very valid. That's very valid.
Yeah. And so it's been tricky to navigate for me and for me personally because, I don't want to hold my kids back, but I think that it is really important to understand what other families boundaries are around devices.
Yeah.
I have friends who, when they host sleepovers, they take devices or they don't allow devices. I have other friends who say, "Oh, I don't know what they're doing. They lock themselves in the room and I see them in the morning." And so I think as a parent, it's a really individualized decision, but it is important to understand what environment is my child going to be in
Right.
and who else is going to be there. I've heard of situations where kids went to sleepovers and the parents maybe left them with an older sibling, but that wasn't necessarily understood from the
Mm-hmm.
beginning. And the other thing is, people make accusations that some can sound a lot of different ways, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like somebody accidentally walks in on someone in a bathroom and then comes home and says, like, I saw so and so's older brother naked, and people lose their minds, and then there's some investigation, you realize,
Wow. Yeah.
right? So I think it really is important for the parents and the adults to communicate with each other, understand what the situation is, have these kinds of talks with kids so that they know what is to be expected, what is appropriate. And then the other piece, right, is like the whole kind of model of this work that I do in Askable Mama is really about being approachable. And so, really hoping that you have opened the lines of communication enough and that you have a child who feels safe to come and talk to you about this if something were to happen.
Yeah. Well, we talk about, starting at a young age, but what about parents right now who are listening now and they're like, "Oh, my child is
Yeah.
11, 12 years old and we don't use the word penis in our house." Like,
Yeah.
what can I do now?
Yeah. It's never too late, right? Or maybe the best way to say it is better late than never. Because I do have a lot of parents who come to me and say, "Oh my gosh, like we haven't talked about anything, and now my kid's in puberty." So start talking. I mean, puberty is probably the easiest time to find natural conversation starters because every song, I mean, I don't know if you watched the VMAs last night, but oh my gosh, it was like looking at the outfits and the words of the song and like I mean, half the dances seemed like sex acts, and
Right,
they
right.
were like, "Oh my gosh." Um, so, so I think that for tween and teen parents, the opportunities of natural conversation starters are really, really helpful. And I love the idea of asking kids, "What do you know about that?" Or "Where did you hear about that?" 69
Mm,
is a great example. Kids
wow.
start giggling about 69 in fourth, fifth grade, laughing, laughing.
Really? So this is what I'm okay.
Yes, but often the kids don't know why they're laughing. They're
Okay.
laughing because someone else laughed, who's laughing because someone else laughed, because someone's older brother said like, but they don't know, they're just laughing. And
Hmm.
so I think being able to ask kids what they already know and meet them where they are is really important. And then the other thing I would say about starting conversations around 11, 12 years old is that, and obviously, again, like with building blocks, I don't want this to sound totally out of context, but that's about the age that kids have their own cell phone or social media access or more access online often. Kids should not have that access without
Agree.
having had conversations about online safety. And I do not know how a parent has a conversation in 2024 about online safety and is not talking about sexting and pornography and sextortion. It's not possible.
Wow.
Can
Well,
can
let's talk
you,
about that.
yeah,
Like,
please.
how do we talk to our children about
Yeah.
sexting and pornography and sextortion? Because, like, that is something that I'm like, well, my children are probably not going to get a cell phone till they're much older than their peers. But
Good for you.
I don't know. Those are my thoughts now. I
Yes,
don't
it
know
changed.
what's going to change, but
Sure.
how do I have those conversations
Yeah.
about that?
So much of it is language. And because I think that we can actually be having those conversations over a huge span of development. Like, I think that a 5-year-old who has access to an iPad should also have some awareness that there are wild things on the internet that pop up, you didn't know they were there, and then suddenly they're there. And sometimes they could seem scary or funny, or you could see naked people, or like, I think it's a very casual way. What I just said is a very casual way to kind of introduce this concept when kids are a little bit younger. As they're moving into adolescence, I think it's that same type of conversation, but saying, and it's okay to say this may sound crazy or outlandish to you, but if and when it happens, I want you to remember that I'm telling you it happens, and it happens a lot. And we are giving you this thing that provides access to the entire world, but it also allows access for the entire world to you in
Mm.
many ways. And that means that there are people out there who might have bad intentions, who might send things that seem creepy or odd. I think giving, again, kind of very specific examples about, text messages from people you don't know, don't engage, don't
Right.
engage. I think at that age, talking really overtly about what sextortion is can be important. One way I would speak to that is, it's this thing that happens where someone might pretend they know you, they might engage with you over weeks or months and try to elicit pictures from you. And if you send the pictures, they can make threats that they're going to release them. So that's one example of why we would never, ever send a photo of ourselves. The other thing is, nothing that happens on a cell phone is private.
Mhm.
And this is a controversial thing that I say. A lot of my very close friends who have kids the same age as I do not agree with me on this. But I feel that it is important to monitor your kids' phones. And I think that they should know that you're doing so from the get-go.
Right.
And for my kids, for my older one, when he got a phone, he got a contract that said, we own this phone. We will be checking it. Here are all the rules that go with the phone so that there's no surprises if I someday have to go back and say, hey, I saw what, someone sent you on Snap, or I saw this website you were at. Um, and the reason I feel that way is because there isn't privacy on phones, period. Whatever you text and send is out there, even if it's on Snapchat, someone can take a picture, right? And so I think it's important for kids to learn from us that this is not a safe and private space.
Hmm.
If you don't want me to see it, you don't want your friends' parents to see it, don't do it.
Right. Wow. That's scary. That's scary, but definitely very important because I know that kids are getting phones because they get dropped off somewhere, and yeah, I think that can be very scary, but again, very important. The tough conversations are the important conversations to have, right?
Yes. Yes.
Um, I do want to talk briefly, like for girls and boys. I know for me growing up, I have an older brother, and it was like everything was so different for my brother, right? Like
Yeah.
you're the one who could get pregnant, so we're gonna worry about you. Like
Yeah.
I have a daughter and a son also, and so now, we're having the same conversations. I mean,
Yeah.
at different ages, obviously. I'm not talking to him about
Sure.
showing him perfectly normal. My son is 6, but the same conversations should be had, correct? Like with even
Yeah.
for like puberty,
Yes. Yes.
can we talk to our children about I know I see like comments all the time like why would you talk to your son about periods? They don't have periods and tampons. Oh, that's terrible. Why would you talk to them
Yes.
about that? And I'm like, why wouldn't you?
Exactly, exactly. I mean, this is an area where I think what I was speaking to earlier about what I bring to this work specifically, is really helpful in the sense that I am working with adults and couples and seeing how things have played out in adult relationships based on how the sexual health topics were gendered. I mean, I have met with truly, I have met with adults, I've met with couples who do not know about one another's anatomy. It is shocking to men to find out how many holes women have in their bodies, to put it bluntly. I have
Yeah.
worked with couples who were trying to get pregnant, and the male identifying partner had no idea. This is more than one, though. I don't want to pretend it's one. Really no idea how that works. That the
Wow.
mechanics of ovulation and frequency of ovulation. So there are real reasons for both genders to understand how one another's bodies work. I also think that normalizes a lot of other parts of sexual health as we age, right? Like
Hmm.
just understanding what somebody's anatomy is and does. So that's one piece. The other thing here is that I think when we only talk to kids kind of gender to gender, there is a shame and a kind of a sense of denormalizing that I think can happen just by, right? Like, oh, you got your period, talk to your mom about that. That's a thing that
Mm.
men or boys don't want to have anything to do with. If we talk about consent only to girls, it implies that it is a woman's girl's job to set boundaries. And
Right.
not only is it not their job to set boundaries, it is not their job to maintain those boundaries, right? When a boundary is set, it is everybody's job to maintain it. And often, the way we talk about these issues, it tends to be more men having the trouble maintaining it. Now, that is not a universal statement, um, but I have heard parents say, like, well, I only really have to talk to my daughter about boundaries and consent, right? Well, no, no.
Right.
Um, and unfortunately, I think the landscape around how we talk about sexual assault has changed in this country, and especially in the university systems, where a lot of universities move to an adjudication process where if somebody accuses somebody of sexual assault, it can be not tried in a court of law, but kind of brought in an administrative hearing at the university. And
Mhm.
so I bring this up just to kind of reiterate the point of why it is so important for kids of both genders to understand what does it mean to be intimate with someone and really hear their boundary, respect their boundary. Consent is not a one-time yes. It's every interaction over the course of time needs to be consented to. And there
Right.
are these cases coming up on college campuses where someone was saying, well, we've had sex 10 times. And the other person was saying, yeah, but that night I didn't want to. And now we're in this situation where prior consent was somebody was assuming consent based on prior consent. So sorry, I went off on a tangent, but
No, no, this is great information.
yeah, so it's absolutely important to talk about these things across genders.
Yes, I agree. I know that it may feel uncomfortable because I mean, even when I think about like my husband, like when I needed him to get me tampons or get me um whatever I needed like for my period, it what for him it wasn't like, oh, gross, no, but I know that there are men who are just like, that's not my department. Um,
Exactly. And imagine, because I have seen this happen, I know this happens. Imagine if you are raising a boy who knows from forever that his mom gets her period and that every 20 to 30 days she requires these things that you get at CVS. How different that is
yeah.
than in a home where it was never talked about and it was this really secretive time. And it is different. And it's a place that we have opportunity to kind of see it play out differently very easily.
Oh yeah. Yeah, that it just kind of reminded me. We were traveling and we were in Greece and my son, so there's this joke in my house because my cycle happens to fall, during the full moon. That when there's that I don't know if it was blue moon, but in Greece you could see it full like fully. And we were in like a golf cart with like a person who was driving it to our place. And my son's like, oh, it's the guy's like, oh, look at the moon. There's a full moon party that's happening tomorrow. And my son was like, oh yeah, my mom's a werewolf. Like she's very cranky whenever there's a full moon because of her period. I'm like, okay, well, we're freely talking about this in our house. So
Yeah.
that was very I was
Yeah.
like, okay, yes, this is very true.
Yeah.
But no, I'm not a werewolf. So yeah, so I love having like these conversations. And you know what? My son is going to be completely like fine when his wife is
Yeah.
going to ask him to grab her, grab
Right.
tampons. He'll be like, okay, yeah.
Right.
That'll just be such an easy that would be a non-conversation. It'll be like, okay, what do you need from the store?
Yes.
And I think that's the point in having these conversations, like you were saying, from a young age. Like it doesn't seem so scary and like
Right.
such a thing once it gets to be really important.
Exactly. That's right.
Yeah.
There's a level of shame that doesn't have to exist.
No, not at all. Not at all. Um, Melissa, is there anything else that you would like to add that I didn't touch on?
I mean, I could talk about this for the next 6 weeks. So no end.
Maybe I need to have you back on because I think this is a very, very interesting topic and so, so important.
Yeah, I mean, I really agree. I think the main point that I hope people can take away from this is not a sense of, oh no, I haven't done this, or oh my gosh, I have to get to that, but more that over the course of time of raising kids, we have these opportunities to find natural conversation starters, to really listen to our kids' questions and what they're talking about, and create an environment where they feel safe and comfortable talking about sexual health issues of all types. And I never want people to walk away feeling like they've messed up or they've missed a window, because that opportunity is always there. And I will say too, I have an Instagram account at askable_mama. I do workshops for parents. I do consults with parents as well if they have a more specific thing they want to talk about. But you can reach out to me on Instagram or at my website. I love talking about this stuff. I love getting good questions and finding ways to help parents navigate these kinds of conversations.
Awesome. What a great resource. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you joining today.
It was great to be here. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, that was Melissa Kilbride, licensed social worker and certified sexual health therapist. For more information on Melissa, please visit her website, mlktherapy.com. You can reach her there. And her Instagram handle, like she said, askable_mama. That's MAMA. You could also find our information, including her book that we discussed earlier, in the show notes. September's issue of Authentic Insider is out. Check out Authentic Insider at traumasurvivorthriver.com. That's traumasurvivorthriver.com, as well as past episodes of a Trauma Survivor Thrivers podcast. If you haven't already, please subscribe to my email list to get Authentic Insider magazine in your inbox monthly. Thank you again for joining me for the start of season 6. You've been listening to a Trauma Survivor Thrivers podcast. I'll see you next week when we discuss Scars to Stars and social media responsibility with Dr. Jamie Heisman. I'm Lorilee Binstock. Thank you for being a part of the conversation. Take care.